world of widows. New enemies. I'm done running from my past.
Hi guys, this is officially the Zoom of my dreams, just so we are all clear right now.
Yay!
Fun dream.
Yes,
Because so many Zooms are like nightmarish, right?
exactly. But I mean, to both of you, this fantastic lighting. I mean, this is nailing it right now. Scarlett, you finally have your own movie after 10 years. I have a feeling security may tackle me through Zoom for this next question, but we know that it is pre-Infinity War and post-Civil War. But what can you tell us about where we find Natasha in this film?
You know, Natasha in this film is really in a place of great vulnerability. She's always been a part of a organization or like a family of some sort, or, you know, working for someone that was part of a greater movement or cause. And now she's kind of lost, and, you know, she's alone for the first time maybe ever. And she is forced to face her own trauma and her own tragedy and her own demons, and you know, is basically dragged kicking and screaming by her younger sister, Yelena, who forces her to be self-reflective and say, you know, this happened to us and I was there too. And what are we going to do about it? You know, how do we prevent other young women from experiencing this? And it's a very intense emotional journey for her.
Speaking of intense emotional journeys, Florence, welcome to the MCU. Congratulations. What was the moment you realized the magnitude of the MCU? And in addition, when did you realize that your chemistry between Scarlett and yourself is off the charts? Did you know, like, straight out the gate?
I knew that I enjoyed taking the piss out of her, and I knew that she enjoyed it too. The moment I realized how big, like, the world of MCU was when we went to Comic-Con. I think when you physically see all the people that this matters to them and this means something to them, it was like, oh my God, this many people are gonna watch our movie.
Welcome to the MCU. I have to know, directing the first solo film for a founding Avenger, was that task as insane as it sounds? And what are you most proud of?
Probably the thing I'm most proud of is probably the relationships between especially Florence and Scarlett, and the action sequences I really love.
I mean, listen, I could watch those guys go all day, and, you know, and that's on camera. You know, when I'm doing the scenes, when the camera goes cut, they're still chatting. It's just absurd, their chemistry. It really makes the movie, in my opinion.
There are so many action sequences in this movie, but was one of the most impressive to me was the jail scene. It's insane. Walk me through that process. Like, what was that like?
The fact that you could shoot a single frame of that and it could come out of, because the amount of variables involved in shooting any of that, you have, you know, you're outdoors in this amphitheater that's enormous. You have 400 people running around doing various choreography. You have a crane camera sweeping around. You have me on like a wire jumping up walls, doing all these things. You know, the people that do these things are the best at what they do. So yeah, I was just blown away by the scale and scope of what this is.
Can you tell us about Red Guardian? What are some, like, can you give us any insight?
Yeah, I mean, you know, he's a guy who Scarlett's character, Natasha, has known for a lot of her life, and he was very important to her when she was younger, and they've lost touch for a lot of different reasons, and they're going to reunite now. And he's also someone who had a certain superhero career of his own, and now is past his prime and needs to go on his own redemptive arc around the poor choices he's made in his life, emotionally and nutritionally and spiritually and all these different ways. So he's a very three-dimensional guy. I don't know, you know, people are always interested in good guys and bad guys. I think he's just human. I don't know if he's a good guy or a bad guy. I think he's a bit of both.
Here's what's gonna happen.
Natasha, don't slouch.
I'm not slouching.
You're going to get a back hunch.
Listen to your mother.
Oh my God, this...
Up,
All right, enough. All of you.
I didn't say anything. That's not fair.
We see a side to Natasha in this film that we haven't seen in the first 10 years of her being on the big screen. So how closely did you work with Scarlett to make sure that her history was coming into this film?
We worked really closely right from the start. So I was in Australia and she was in New York, and we were speaking about not only the character, but about her life and my life, so that we could kind of work out what we wanted the film to be about. And then we were speaking to Kevin Feige, and he brought in the whole idea of family. So it's really about her journey as a character, and then her journey within this family, and what those relationships do to her. And I think they really open her up and allow us to see different aspects that we've never seen before, really.
At some point, we all have to choose between what the world wants you to be and who you are.
These stories mean a lot to people.
Well, they sure do mean to a tremendous amount of people who will all be going to Regal to see this movie on the big screen where it belongs. Congratulations, ladies. Thank you so much. And I'm obsessed with this film, so congrats.
Aw,
Thank you.
so much.